This video goes over the late 1800s and early 1900s. In the late 1800s, there were lots of changes in America. The Second Industrial Revolution led to the internal combustion engine, innovations in the field of electricity, and the mass manufacturing of goods. Factories created more jobs, so many people moved to the city. A lot of people immigrated to America, and many of those immigrants worked in factories. By 1900, 40% of Americans lived in large cities. The emergence of capitalism in America led to a new class structure. Before, wealth was largely inherited in America, but with capitalism, anyone could become wealthy. Businessmen often had large monopolies and earned money at the expense of the working class. Working class people lived hard lives. Housing was limited in the city. It was common for residents to live in tenement buildings, which were cheap and poorly constructed apartments. Living conditions were bad in these buildings. The apartments were cramped, and the buildings often had no plumbing and lots of disease. Working conditions were also bad. Employees had no employee benefits and very little job security. Workers worked long hours and were often underpaid. In the late 1800s, a new scientific field, known as sexology, emerged that sought to understand human sexuality. The words homosexual and heterosexual began to be used to describe people. One widely accepted theory in the field of sexology was that people who experienced same-sex desire had, quote, inverted or reversed genders. If a man desired men, it was thought that it was because he was actually a woman in a man's body. And if a woman desired women, it was thought that it was because she was actually a man in a woman's body. This theory led to stereotypes. Homosexual men were stereotyped as feminine, and lesbians were stereotyped as being very masculine. Sexology affected the way medical professionals and the public thought about sexuality for decades. Sexology also led to the medicalization of homosexuality. Before sexology, same-sex desire was only seen as a sin or a moral wrong. But after sexology emerged, homosexuality was seen as an illness. For the first time, homosexuals could feel diseased. Some medical professionals claimed that they could, quote, cure homosexuality using conversion therapy. Conversion therapy could consist of talk therapy, hormone injections, electroshock therapy, harsh chemicals, threats of physical violence, or food and water deprivation. These cruel methods of treatment did not cure homosexuals, but it did cause them immense mental and physical harm. No credible scientific study has ever claimed that conversion therapy can change someone's sexual orientation. The American man changed once again. He was no longer an outlaw. The American man was a good citizen and a respectable man. He became strong, athletic, and full of patriotism for his country. He was white, heterosexual, and the opposite of the stereotypical feminine homosexual man. At the time, many women were dependent on men. Women were expected to care for their husbands and children. They couldn't own property or vote, and any money they made had to be given to their husbands. Most women didn't go to college, and those who did were frowned upon. Women didn't like this system, so they fought to change it. Women who fought for political independence and the right to vote were known as suffragists. Black women often struggled to make their voices heard in the movement, so they formed their own suffrage organizations. These women had similar goals to the goals of white suffragists, but they also fought against discriminatory laws that made it harder for black men to vote. In 1920, the 19th Amendment passed, and women were given the right to vote. Many women faced violence, domestic abuse, and single motherhood due to their partners abandoning them. Many of these problems were caused by alcoholism. These women formed social purity groups to combat vices such as alcoholism, gambling, and prostitution. Men were also part of these groups. Social purity groups were one of the reasons the Prohibition went into effect. These groups have ties tracing back to the Puritans. Many of their ideas about morality were based on the Puritans' religious beliefs. Many social purity groups believed that male lust damaged society, but that female virtue could improve it. Social purity groups affected how broader American culture thought about sexuality. Many social purists worried about the impact of vices on children and young adults. They wanted to protect them from what they thought were harmful things so that they could grow into normal, moral, heterosexual adults. Social purity groups were often racist. Many of them believed in racial purity and linked race to, quote, a moral sexuality. Most social purists believed that if people had sex for any purpose other than reproduction, it was wrong. They also believed that sexual thoughts were immoral and bad. Many young people moved from small towns to big cities in search of new opportunities. These young people typically weren't married. Families used to be the norm in cities, but with many young men and women moving to the cities, that changed. This change led to new gender and sexual normalities and new ways to socialize. Cities were rambunctious and unpredictable. they were often home to sexual promiscuity, drinking, and drugs. Cities were seen as full of vice and immorality. Many young people were moving to cities, and their families and communities wanted to prevent them from participating in immoral practices. These young men and women were often given moral guides. Moral guides were pamphlets or books with rules and information about morality. These guides were often published by churches and aimed to regulate sexuality. These guides taught young people that sex and sexuality were dangerous. One guide warned that having sex outside of marriage was a sin. Homosexuals couldn't get married, so they couldn't have sex without it being seen as immoral. Cities also had organizations that worked to prevent vice. Many of these organizations worked to ban books, censor nude art, and regulate movies and plays. A majority of the content banned was related to sex, homosexuality, or gender deviance. For example, a book called The Young and the Evil was banned because it had a homosexual character and a positive portrayal of homosexuality. Moral squads also formed in cities to combat vice. More often than not, they were violent towards those who exhibited sexual and gender deviance. Anthony Comstock formed the New York Society for Suppression of Vice, which worked to suppress vice by using the legal system. This was a common tactic used by social reformers to ban what they thought was immoral content. Anthony Comstock also advocated for a law, later named the Comstock Act, which made it illegal to mail obscene material, which included sexual education information and birth control. The worry about homosexuality and gender deviance wasn't really about a book, a movie, or a play. It was about the larger changes in society. It was about regulating and controlling sexuality. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, big political figures such as Senator McCarthy and Richard Nixon scared the public about communists and homosexuals. They never used the word homosexual, instead using words like pervert, sexual deviant, or sexual psychopath. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, wrote an article encouraging the public to take action against homosexuals, whom he referred to as perverts, lest they begin to mutilate and murder people. Many states passed, quote, sexual psychopath laws, which allowed the court to imprison sexual psychopaths in mental institutions. These laws didn't have a clear definition of what a sexual psychopath was, and they didn't require the courts to prove that someone was a sexual psychopath. Anyone who was even suspected of being one could be put in a mental institution. The campaign against sexual psychopaths operated under the pretense that these laws would protect children. In the public's mind, the words pervert, degenerate, sexual psychopath, child molester, and homosexual all meant the same thing. This is where the harmful myth that male homosexuals molest children came from. It's important to note that according to the American Psychiatric Association, homosexuals are no likelier than heterosexuals to hurt or molest children. Many lesbians thought that the laws passed by social purity groups hurt minorities. These women worked on projects that affected the lives of women and children. Mary Equi studied medicine and became a doctor. At the time, only 6% of doctors in the United States were women. She worked to provide women with access to birth control and abortions, both of which were illegal at the time. In 1906, when San Francisco was hit with a devastating earthquake, Equi traveled to San Francisco to help with disaster relief. She earned a commendation from the U.S. Army for her work there. Equi was a suffragist and a labor organizer. She was a strike leader and was arrested many times due to her activism. She was also an advocate for world peace and protested against America joining World War I. She was arrested and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Equi was a lesbian. She didn't try to hide her sexuality. She and her girlfriend, Harriet Specker, were a visible, obvious couple. The two of them adopted a child together. Equi and Specker wrote letters to one another every day while she was incarcerated. Equi was released on good behavior after spending 10 months in prison. She and Specker ended up separating but remained friends. When Equi was older, many young activists and organizers went to her for advice. Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady, had a network of female friends, many of whom were lesbians. These women were involved in politics and women's rights. Labor reform, racial justice, and anti-militarism were all important to them. Eleanor Roosevelt and these women helped shape national policy and the New Deal. The New Deal was a series of laws and programs aimed at restoring the economy and helping those who were struggling due to the Great Depression. Hull House was founded in 1889 and was the first settlement house in America. Settlement houses were community-based organizations in poor, working-class neighborhoods. Settlement workers, often middle-class people, lived in the settlement houses and shared their knowledge with the community. Most people who lived in the area around Hull House were European immigrants who spoke little English and were not paid very much by their employers. Hull House offered many services to the community. They taught English classes, taught vocational skills, ran a daycare, ran an employment bureau, had a public kitchen, public baths, and ran a health clinic. Hull House also became a place for labor organizers to meet and work towards their goals of safe working conditions, fair pay, and fair working hours. Hull House had a big impact on its community and inspired others to create their own settlement houses. By 1914, 33 states had at least one settlement house. Hull House was founded by Jane Addams and Ellen Starr. The two women were romantically involved for quite some time, but eventually drifted apart. Jane Addams was famous for her activism for fair labor and world peace. She was a part of the Women's Peace Party and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Towards the end of her life, she won a Nobel Peace Prize for her work. Cities had more privacy and anonymity than small towns, which allowed homosexuals and people who defied gender normalities to form communities. Many homosexuals moved to cities to find others like them. San Francisco and Greenwich Village in New York both had thriving homosexual communities. These cities had many drinking establishments frequented by both homosexual men and lesbians. These bars often employed male and female impersonators as entertainers. The bars were popular tourist attractions. Visiting heterosexuals were fascinated and entertained by the culture. African American communities also formed in cities. In the early 1900s, the New York neighborhood of Harlem was full of political activism and art. Many Harlem cultural leaders were homosexuals or defied gender norms. Harlem was also home to drag balls where men and women would cross-dress in elaborate outfits. While there was homophobia in Harlem, the neighborhood was often more accepting of those who broke gender and sexual normalities than the general public was. Entertainment in America changed and grew a lot in the early 1900s. Public entertainment was often a place to push the boundaries of gender and sexual normalities. It was common for people to cross-dress on stage. Many actors and actresses were homosexual men and lesbians, and their sexuality was an open secret to the public. The gender and sexual deviance of plays and movies was a threat to purity culture. Social purity groups lobbied to censor movies and plays. One example of this is when the New York Society for Suppression of Vice worked with the district attorney to shut down a play with lesbian themes. The actors and actresses were arrested. Shortly after the event, the state of New York passed a law that made it illegal to show plays that had homosexual characters or themes. It also passed a law that allowed theaters to be shut down for a year if they put on a play that was considered obscene. At the time, homosexual themes and cross-dressing were considered obscene. A few plays closed, but the ban led to a disturbing consequence. Gender and sexual deviance vanished from the stage and the view of the public. Social purity groups also worked to censor movies. Protestant and Catholic social purity groups pressured Hollywood executives to create strict industry regulations against, quote, immoral content, and threatened to lobby for government regulation if the executives didn't comply. These regulations were often referred to as the Hays Code. The Hays Code prevented adultery and non-marital sex from being portrayed in a positive or neutral way in movies. It also prohibited any depictions of homosexuality. These rules went into place in 1930 and weren't changed until the mid-1950s. In the modern day, the words female impersonator and drag queen can be interchangeable, but that wasn't always the case. Female impersonation was popularized in America by minstrel shows. Minstrel shows were shows where white performers wore blackface and performed racist caricatures of African Americans. Female impersonators in minstrel shows imitated African American women. Another form of entertainment with female impersonators was vaudeville. Vaudeville shows were variety shows that often had comical elements. Female impersonators in these shows usually aimed to imitate upper-class white women. Drag was a subculture of female impersonation. Drag in America was generally found in African American and Latino communities. William Dorsey Swann, an African American man and former slave, was one of the first Americans to call himself a drag queen. He wore satin dresses and hosted private drag balls at his house in Washington, D.C. Many of his guests were African American men. These parties were invite-only, and their secrecy allowed Swann and his guests to dress up without being harassed by the public. It was risky to attend these balls. In 1888, Swann's house was raided by the police. Swann himself tried to stop the police from entering his residence, which allowed some of his guests to escape. Swann and the rest of his guests were arrested and charged with being suspicious characters. Their names were printed in the papers. Swann continued to host drag balls after his arrest and was arrested several other times. In 1896, he was falsely charged with owning a brothel and sentenced to 300 days in prison. Swann wrote a letter to President Grover Cleveland to appeal for a pardon. His appeal, while ultimately unsuccessful, was the first recorded act of LGBT resistance in America. Swann eventually stopped hosting events at his house. but underground drag balls continued in Washington, D.C. and spread to other cities. They were particularly common in Harlem. Julian Altinge was a very famous female impersonator. In 1906, he performed for King Edward VII. He was in multiple Broadway productions and was an international star. He was also one of the most well-known movie stars of his time. He played both men and women in silent films. At the time, most female impersonators dressed up as women for comedic purposes. They played caricatures of women, and their acts were meant to be taken as a joke. Julian Altinge was different. He convincingly played the role of a woman, and newspapers wrote that he was the perfect example of femininity. The people who watched his shows were convinced that he was a woman, and the men who attended them swooned. In the hands of Julian Altinge, gender became a costume, an act that one could put on. Many members of the public assumed that Altinge was a homosexual, but Altinge vehemently denied the accusations. Altinge and his press team worked hard to make him appear manly and masculine offstage. They wrote about him smoking, getting into fights, and his fishing abilities. In the early 1800s, cross-dressing was not associated with sexuality. But in the late 1800s and early 1900s, that changed. Gender and sexuality became linked in the public's mind, likely due to the sexological theory of reverse genders. Cross-dressers, especially men who cross-dressed, were questioned about their sexuality and sanity. Many states passed laws that made it illegal to cross-dress in public. Nightclubs and theaters in those states couldn't have male and female impersonators perform anymore. The cross-dressing laws prevented Julian Altinge from dressing as a woman in one of his final shows. He instead stood next to a mannequin wearing the dress he would have worn while performing. As a child, Gladys Bentley disliked wearing dresses and frequently broke her school's dress code. The other kids made fun of her for doing so. When she was an adult, Bentley moved to Harlem so that she could be herself. She performed at speakeasies, which were illegal bars. They were illegal because the prohibition banned alcohol. Bentley was a male impersonator and often wore a white tuxedo and top hat. She sang raunchy lyrics about her love for women. Bentley was a popular nightclub singer and a very influential jazz artist. In the 1930s, Bentley moved to Los Angeles. She often performed at a known homosexual establishment, wearing her classic male attire. But eventually, the police prevented her from performing in male attire, citing the laws that banned cross-dressing. Bentley later found her way to San Francisco and performed at the city's homosexual and lesbian clubs. In the 1950s, when Bentley was older, she worked to change her image and would claim that she was no longer attracted to women. This likely occurred because the 50s were a time of intense conservatism where being a homosexual was considered being a national menace. In 1933, when the prohibition ended, many speakeasies closed. Liquor licenses were given to respectable venues. Homosexual and lesbian establishments were generally not considered respectable venues. If a homosexual or lesbian bar managed to get a hold of a liquor license, they would likely be subject to violence and frequent police raids. People could be arrested just for being present in a known homosexual establishment. The names of the arrested would be printed in newspapers, which could cause them to be fired from their jobs, publicly shamed, ostracized from their family, or evicted from their residence. To review, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, many people lived in cities. Sexology was a scientific field that sought to understand sexuality. The American man became the pinnacle of patriotism and the opposite of a stereotypical homosexual man. Women fought for political independence and the right to vote. Social purity groups worked to ban books and censor movies and plays. Politicians and government officials scared the public about homosexuals, whom they often referred to as perverts or sexual psychopaths. As a result, many states passed laws that allowed suspected sexual psychopaths to be imprisoned in mental institutions. These laws didn't have a clear definition of what a sexual psychopath was, and didn't require the courts to prove that someone was a sexual psychopath, which meant that anyone who was even suspected of being one could be put in a mental institution. Many lesbians worked to help other women and their communities. Mary Equi, an open lesbian who adopted a child with her partner, was a suffragist and a labor organizer. Eleanor Roosevelt and her friends, many of whom were lesbians, worked to implement policies such as the New Deal. Jane Addams and Ellen Starr founded Hull House, a settlement house that offered services to the community. Cities allowed homosexual communities, such as those in San Francisco, Greenwich Village, and Harlem, to form. Drag was a subculture of female impersonation. William Dorsey Swann, one of the first Americans to call himself a drag queen, hosted drag balls at his house and was arrested numerous times. In 1896, he was arrested on false charges and appealed for a presidential pardon. His appeal was the first recorded act of LGBT resistance in America. Julian Altinge was a famous female impersonator. He convincingly played the role of a woman, and in his hands, gender became a costume, an act one could put on. Gladys Bentley was a male impersonator who sang raunchy songs about her love for women in Harlem, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. Homosexual and lesbian establishments were subject to violence and police raids. The names of the arrested would be printed in newspapers, which could cause them to be fired from their job, publicly shamed, ostracized from their family, or evicted from their residence.